This is going to be a breakdown of our recently released State of Our Birds report. It was a big task, and many of you on this call were responsible for contributing data that allowed us to generate this report. And so for those of you who are on this call who helped collect data, submit data, I thank you very much. And the work that we do, simply put, is not possible without your buy-in, either as concerned citizens for our birds, or as people who actually want to go out and do some birding for a purpose, and contribute the observations you make to a big science project, a big data science project, such as the one that we're doing here at Audubon. So in case you don't know me, I'm Charles Clarkson. I am the Director of Avian Research for the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. And I took a year of data that was largely collected by over 80 of our volunteers, and quite a bit of it was also collected by myself and some technicians. And I took the information that we found out about our birds and translated it into this 90 some odd page document about what we know about our birds. So tonight I'm going to discuss what we do know, put it in the context of the larger framework of what is happening to our global and North American bird populations, and then finish up with kind of a few slides on talking about where we plan to go from here. So I think it's incredibly important that everyone understand two major things about this report. The first is that it doesn't tell us anything new about how our birds are doing. Yes, it is very specific to our refuges, but that specificity is more geared towards how our birds are using our refuges, which is a second big chunk of the report. Part of the report was really just quantifying our bird populations across the Mid-Atlantic and New England region and looking at how they have fared over the last 50 to 60 years. However, if you have been paying attention at all to the news on the global front, on our own national front, or just contained here within North America, with regards to ecosystem health, wildlife populations, then you are aware of the fact that multiple wildlife populations, and birds are no exception, have been declining for quite some time. I've actually been interviewed a large number of times since this report has come out. And one of the first questions asked by all of these interviewers is, were we surprised by the results? And I almost hope from time to time when I'm asked that question that it is, it's not a literal question, and that everyone truly is not surprised by this, because quite frankly, like I stated, we've known about these declines for quite some time. A paper published in 2019 by the Audubon Society, the National Audubon Society, in conjunction with research done by a number of other groups, to include the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, documented that the North American landscape has lost roughly 1/3 of all birds since the year 1970. So that's total numbers of individuals, or roughly 2.9 or 3 billion individuals lost from the North American landscape in just a 50-year period. That's absolutely striking and quite devastating, actually, if you think about the fact that such a degree of loss occurred over such a short period of time. But this research has been conducted on a national scale, looking at large data-driven collection schemes like eBird, and they've all documented the same thing, that eastern forest birds have lost almost 200 million birds, 200 million individual birds since 1970. 6 in 10 of all wood thrushes have disappeared in just the last 50 years. Grassland birds, which is a guild of species that all rely on early successional scrub, shrub, and grassland habitats. These birds have been lost at a rate of almost 1 billion birds since 1970. So a massive loss. Eastern meadowlarks are a species that historically would breed in the state of Rhode Island and now are found only in 3 locations and nowhere else in the state. So this is a species that has been hit incredibly hard over the last 50 years. And we're still racing to figure out what the primary drivers are and what we can do about the decline. Aerial insectivores like swallows and swifts, pictured here is a barn swallow, but also tree swallows, chimney swifts, northern rough-winged swallows. These birds have all been hit very hard, largely as a result of declining insect populations from climate change, from habitat loss, from the application of pesticides. Migratory birds, if you were to split all birds into two groups, those that migrate and those that do not, those that migrate have a much more difficult time because they have to time all of their biological movements to the environments around them. And quite frankly, the environment around them is changing and has been changing very rapidly through time due to climate change, due to habitat loss and population growth. And so migratory birds, which are so heavily reliant on timing things correctly and utilizing multiple habitats while they are en route to either wintering grounds or breeding grounds, are being hit very hard. And so 2.5 billion birds that are migratory lost since 1970. So collectively, all of this basically tells us that a quarter of all of our birds have been lost since 1970. And while this is incredibly striking, it is at the macro scale. So this is looking at all of the birds collectively through time and documenting an average decline across multiple individual species through a multi-decadal time scale. But the fact of the matter is, for those of us who are studying specific species, we've also been documenting declines for quite a while. So documenting declines in species like the black-throated blue warbler, common grackle, has been in decline for quite some time. There are a number of researchers studying this specific species. Prairie warbler, which is one of our responsibility birds, the cerulean warbler population, the Canada warbler population. So we know that not only are large-scale avian communities in decline, but so too are individual species. And we've had all of this information for quite some time. So this is all to say that when someone asks me, was I surprised at the findings that a third of all the birds that reside on Audubon refuges are experiencing long-term declines? The answer is no, and quite frankly, no one should be surprised to hear that, because this information has been available for quite some time. It is also the case that we have to come to terms with the fact that birds might not be lost forever in the form of extinction, but rather we might have severe loss to the avian community around us due to things like shifting ranges. So this figure shows you the species vulnerability groups by habitat type, and this is looking at the highly vulnerable species to outright extinction should things go on as they are with no change in terms of our emissions, in terms of our population growth, in terms of the big drivers for population decline for birds. If all of that stays the same, then we can expect that species that reside in the Arctic, 100% of those species that are found in the Arctic region of our planet are likely to go extinct in the near future. Boreal forests, 98%. If you go all the way down to eastern forest, right there, you can see that 59% or roughly 60% of all the birds that reside here in the New England area in our eastern forests are likely to be driven to extinction because of the changes to our climate and the other insults that they are experiencing, which is driving their population down. That's just the birds that are actually going to be lost, meaning through extinction. We also have displacement, and here's a good example of that. This is the blue-headed vireo, and this is a species that's actually relatively common in the state of Rhode Island as a breeding bird. We get them throughout periods of migration, but a number of blue-headed vireos will stay and breed in the state of Rhode Island. And here in red, you can see the current breeding range of the blue-headed warbler, so a blue-headed vireo. So this is a species that is found throughout New England, throughout southern Canada and into the western portions of Canada, and down the Appalachian spine into North and South Carolina. So this species is found over that entire region, and it just so happens that this area in red is also the area of the range that this species will lose given 3 degrees Celsius increase in our overall temperature. So this is the range that the bird will lose. And in blue, you can see the range that the bird is projected to gain. What this tells us is that through time, should things remain as they are, the globe continues to warm, habitats continue to change. As the blue-headed vireo seeks to track the moving habitat across the landscape, it will be pulled further and further north from its current range. And while this is a species found here in Rhode Island now, give it 20 to 30 years, you might actually have to go into northern portions of Canada to find a blue-headed vireo that is nesting. So this is another kind of loss that is expected to occur due to climate change and other factors contributing to the loss of habitat. So the conservation hill is steep and has been for quite some time. We know that climate change is driving 2/3 of all species extinct very slowly as they decline precipitously in their overall population size through time. Pesticide use kills on order of 70 to 80 million birds every single year. House cats and feral cats kill over 2 billion birds in the United States alone every single year. And window strikes claim almost 500 million birds during mostly periods of migration when they are flying into windows. So there are lots of proximate drivers that are leading to the declines of birds. There's no longer a silver bullet, whereas we can identify one thing that we can correct and see huge population growth. There is no longer just one thing that can be done. All of these factors need to be met with very stringent management plans that are dedicated to addressing that specific source of decline. There's a lack of progress. We know that our Paris Climate Accord has a goal of limiting the degree of warming on this planet to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but currently we are still on trend to experience almost 3% degrees Celsius increase. So even though we have a goal, we are still far from it. And the unfortunate part about that is that a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees Celsius is considered by many to be catastrophic in terms of its impacts on wildlife populations and birds in particular. Again, if you've been keeping tabs on how bad things have gotten, you'll know that the annual State of the Birds report, which is a report that is released every single year looking at across the entirety of the United States of America, has documented severe declines in all of the bird species that they analyzed that are found throughout the US as well. So here are just the declining trend graphs for species associated with grassland habitats, western and eastern forest habitats, shorebirds, and here is a list of all of the species that over the course of the last 50 years have actually lost half of the entirety of their population. And those that are in red are species that have lost half of their population and are projected to lose another half of what they have remaining over the next 50 years. So incredible rates of decline seen for a large group of birds here. And everything here in a red box is a species that has been known to breed in the state of Rhode Island. So a large number of our breeding birds here in Rhode Island are actually listed as tipping point species in the National State of Our Birds report. So this is all kind of what went into the creation of the Avian Research Initiative at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. There is a very stark message, and it has been in place for quite some time, which is rampant human population growth, global climate change, habitat loss and destruction have all been slowly but surely eroding away our bird populations. And quite frankly, we need to do a few things about that. The first of which is we need to share that information in an effective way with the general public. The researchers doing the work that understands how dire the situation are, generally speaking, do not do a very good job of communicating that information to the general public. And when you are knowledgeable about what the threats are, you're more invested as a steward of the environment and the birds found therein, and there's more that you can actually do to help the situation. And so understanding that we need to be able as scientists to communicate our science to the general public in a meaningful way that you can understand, understanding how important that is one of the big impetuses of the Avian Research Initiative at the Audubon Society. And so that's why we organized this symposium that took place on January 28th. We had 100 folks in attendance. We had researchers from over 20 universities and Audubon societies throughout the New England area come to the state of Rhode Island and provide updates on all the research that they are doing in an easy to understand, highly digestible format. I hope that many of you who are listening to this talk tonight were able to actually go to that symposium. I think it was worthwhile, and it was actually the first of what we hope to be an annual event. But beyond just sharing this messaging, we wanted to do more. We wanted to understand more about what our birds that reside on our 9,500 acres of land that we manage need, what they need from a habitat perspective, and what we can do as conservationists to manage them more effectively. And so that is why we went through this baseline data collection phase. That is why the State of Our Birds report was published. If you have not yet downloaded the report and looked through it, you can find it right on our front webpage, the front of our webpage, or you can use this link, which is asri.org/stateofourbirds, to download that PDF file and look through it, which outlines all of the information in much more detail than I'm about to cover now. For the State of Our Birds report, this is part one of a two-part report that focuses on just the breeding and overwintering period. So birds that are utilizing our refuges as breeding habitat and birds that are found on our refuges during non-breeding periods, or what we would refer to as the overwintering period, when the birds are largely just concerned with one thing, and that is maintaining their own physiological condition and building on fat reserves to fuel their spring migrations. So those are the two periods in which we conducted research for this part one of the State of Our Birds report. And we conducted that research across our 14 publicly accessible refuges. As you can see here, they're scattered throughout the state of Rhode Island, and they total over 3,000 acres of land. So it is a fairly large amount of information to gather, in that it helps us generalize across most of our parcels. The data that we collected were really concerned with answering three really big questions. The first of which is, what is our baseline? First of all, you cannot do anything from a conservation perspective in terms of managing a population effectively unless you understand that population and its needs, how many individuals there are, what their occupancy is, where they're found across the landscape, what habitat types they're affiliated with, and how those habitats might dictate where you find them and where you do not. None of that information can be learned unless you collect very basic baseline data. And so we did that using two big forms. The first of which was the volunteer collected data. Volunteers, over 80 of you, went out and you collected data year-round across our refuges. Every time I put out a call for volunteers, I was happily overwhelmed with a large number of people who wanted to get out and help collect data, and they did. And for the most part, it was relatively easy data to collect, just looking at bird distribution, what birds are found, where they are not. Basically, it was birding with a purpose. People were going birding, and instead of just enjoying the birds themselves, they were sharing with us the information they received, and we were using that information to learn more about our birds in terms of occupancy, in terms of species diversity, in terms of total numbers of individuals. We also wanted to understand more intimately what habitats we conserve at Audubon. So we began to investigate all of the habitats that we conserve across all of our refuges that were being surveyed to better understand exactly what we have available and how that might translate into what bird communities we can expect to see across the landscape when we go out and look for birds. So we did that, and here you can see that our primary habitat type that we conserve is healthy, mature, deciduous forest. It should be no surprise that if you go to an Audubon refuge, you find yourself standing in large tracts of mature forested habitat, mostly in the western parts of the state, but even in the east, if you want to find remnant large mature forests, go to an Audubon refuge and you will. We also have evergreen forest and mixed forest, pasture, hay, scrub, shrub, all the way down through the list of forested swamp environments. And we now know everything that we conserve. So we understand the baseline from our volunteer collected data in terms of what birds are found where, in what numbers. We know what kinds of habitats that we have at the disposal for these birds to utilize when they find themselves transiting through our refuges, either during periods of breeding or during the non-breeding periods. The second big question is then to look at how the regional populations are doing. How are these species doing at a larger spatial scale? In Rhode Island, there have not been these standardized surveys that have been going on for decades of time that help us answer these questions. So we expand our view to entire regions. And we did that in one of two ways. We looked at the breeding birds survey data, which was submitted over the course of 53 years from the Mid-Atlantic and New England bird conservation region. And that is on the left-hand side, outlined in black. This is the region of the country that we analyzed. So I looked at 53 years of data from this area, and I should mention that this is 53 years of data contributed by incredibly passionate bird watchers. Volunteers, citizen scientists, call them what you will. These are people who care about birds, and they have been going out every single year for over 50 years to these transect sites, and they have been counting birds and submitting their data. So without that long-term data set, we would never be able to understand how our regional populations change through time. And as conservationists who really need this big data to help answer these questions, we are indebted to our volunteers and to people who go out and do this kind of work. So on the left, we were looking at this regional scale, and then on the right, we looked at the eBird trends and status data that are coming also from millions, hundreds of millions of observations submitted through eBird, which is a large social media birding site, allowing folks to actually post in real time the birds that they are seeing. And we then can utilize that information to look at trends on the national scale. And so here on the left, you see the regional scale trends, and on the right, you see the national trail scales that show trends through time. And so this helps us to understand how these regional and national trends are showing declines through time. And this is what we see. We see that a large number of our birds are declining. Many of them are stable. Some of them are increasing, but some of the species that you and I consider to be incredibly common have been declining for quite some time. If you look at the blue jay here, you can see that for a 53-year period, it has just been declining pretty steadily at a rate of almost 2% per year over a 53-year period. And so the relative abundance of blue jays was once upon a time in about 35 individuals per transect. So every time you went looking for birds, you'd find about 35 blue jays per transect. Now we're down to about 12. About every time you go out looking for blue jays, you'll find about 12 per transect. With eastern kingbirds, about 9 individuals per transect, all the way down now to roughly 2. So eastern kingbirds have been in decline at a rate even far greater than that of the blue jay. And so now we have a lot more information available to us as a result of the data. And this allows us to visualize how the birds that are residing on Audubon properties are faring across a large regional scale. So whether we're looking at our species from a breeding and overwintering perspective and documenting that 34% of all of the birds that breed on Audubon refuges are experiencing long-term, meaning 50-year consistent declines. 34% are stable, meaning in some years they are fewer individuals available to find during transect surveys, and in some years there are more individuals. So they even out. 25% or a quarter are positive, meaning they have been growing over the last 53 years, and 7% have too few data points to tell. Overwintering populations, pretty much very similar stories. Almost 30% are in decline, 35% are stable, a quarter again are increasing, and 12% have statuses that are unknown. If we break all of these birds into groups considered guilds, and a guild is just a way of combining species that may actually be completely different taxonomically from one another, but because they share very similar lifestyles, habitat choices, food preferences, by lumping them together, you can visualize trends at the avian community level. And if we do that, we lump all of our birds into one of these 12 guilds, we can see how these guilds are faring. And you can see aerial insectivores, roughly 45% of all aerial insectivores, which are, again, remember those swifts and swallows, are declining, experiencing long-term population declines. Species associated with early successional habitat, which is scrub, shrub, low shrubby field growth, 70% of all of those birds affiliated with that habitat type are in decline. Same with grassland species, closer to 80% are in decline for species found affiliated with the grassland habitats. So now we know which species are declining, we know which groups are declining, and a lot of these groups are dependent upon certain habitat types. And so this allows us to then transition into our third big question, which is, okay, on an individual level, what habitats do these birds rely on? We might know that at a large regional scale. If you open your Sibley bird guide, you look at the blue jay account, you might look and see and read that blue jays are distributed across urban and suburban and wooded habitats. Well, that's not incredibly specific because it's generalizing across an entire range. What we want to know is if a blue jay chooses to nest on one of our refuges, or if a blue jay chooses to overwinter on one of our refuges, what habitats are those blue jays associating themselves with? And so this is where the point counts came in. We had 147 point counts stratified across all 14 of these refuges. Here are two examples. On the left, you see Fisherville Brook Wildlife Refuge, and all of these circles are point count stations, most of which are located off trail. And here below that is Maxwell Mays Wildlife Refuge. And again, all of these circles are point count locations. At every single one of these point count locations, I would navigate to the point using a GPS unit. I would count all birds I detected, either seeing them or hearing them, so visual and vocal detections. And then in the lab, I would extract all of the habitats found within a 100-meter diameter circle, or a 100-meter diameter ecological neighborhood, if you will, around that central point in which I conducted my count. So now I know what birds are found there and what habitats are found there. And that allows me to, and when I do that 2 times a year, visit this point count station during the breeding season and again during the non-breeding season, it allows me to understand not just what habitats birds are affiliated with, but also how similar those habitats are between these 2 seasons. In other words, if I want to focus my conservation and management efforts year-round for this bird, how do I focus them during the breeding season? And can I focus on those same habitats during the non-breeding season, or should I be focusing on a completely different suite of habitats for that given species? And so here you can see some examples of this. For the American crow, they were found in 100% of our refuges during the breeding season, 93% during the non-breeding season. During the breeding season, they were found in grassy habitats, so grass herbaceous habitat. During the non-breeding season, however, most of the crows that we detected in forests, where it was more sheltered from inclement weather. On cold and blustery days, those crows tended to find or forage more often in deciduous forested habitat types. So if you look at all of the habitat types that these birds affiliated with throughout these 2 periods, we find 67% similarity, meaning that the bird is relatively generalized. So they have a small degree of generalization, and they will be found in 67% of the same habitat types, regardless of whether you're looking in the breeding season or the non-breeding season. If we look at the black-capped chickadee, this is a species that was found in 100% of our refuges on both surveys. It was associated with scrub shrub habitat in the breeding season. It was also primarily associated with mature or mixed forest habitat types during the non-breeding season. And its habitat similarity between these 2 time periods is only 40%. So black-capped chickadees are even more generalized than we previously thought. They're more generalized than American crows. They actually rely on completely different habitats for the most part. 60% of the habitats almost that they choose from one time to the next is different during these 2 periods. And then lastly, if I look down here at the bottom, the blue jay is a third example, found in 100% of our refuges during the breeding season, affiliated with mixed forest habitats. In the non-breeding season, found on 93% of those refuges surveyed, and they were found in developed high intensity areas. So during the breeding season, blue jays are breeding and foraging in mixed forests, in the forests themselves. During the non-breeding season, they are hanging out in urban and suburban areas, in backyards, at people's feeders. That's exactly what we would expect. And of the 3 species, the blue jays are the most generalized. So there's only a 25% overlap in the habitats that they choose to breed in versus spend their non-breeding season in. So for a species like blue jay, which is in decline and has been declining at a rate of 2% per year for 50 years straight, if we want to focus on managing habitat during both the breeding season and the non-breeding season, we are going to have to concentrate on a wide suite of habitat types. There isn't just one habitat type that the species relies heavily on during both times of the year. So we're learning a lot now about the birds that we have on our refuges because of the habitat types that we are analyzing from those point count stations and the counts themselves that are telling us how many species we have and where they are found. Another modeling technique we ran was actually to determine the relative importance of habitat types for every single one of these species found on our refuge. This is just one example. This is the black-throated green warbler, a species that is found throughout western portions of Rhode Island and on many of our refuges during the breeding season. It is a neotropical migrant, so during the non-breeding season, the species flies south into Central and South America. So this bird relies the most heavily on evergreen forests. Okay, so the predominant habitat type that this particular species was associated with during the breeding season on Audubon refuges was evergreen forest. The next step of the modeling technique we ran was to say, okay, well, these are the top 5 habitat types that we found this species in. How important are they relative to one another? And so the way that the modeling works is it's a machine learning process that takes every single one of the points in which a black-throated green warbler was detected, looks at the habitat type that was found in that ecological neighborhood around that point where that bird was found, and compares those habitats to the habitats that are found across all point count stations. And then the habitat model says, okay, well, it's most often affiliated with this habitat type. It's second most often affiliated with this habitat type, and so on and so forth for the top 5 habitat types. And by categorizing it this way, you can tell the relative importance. So here, the evergreen forests is a relative importance score of 1.24, and the deciduous forest, which is the second most important habitat type that the species was affiliated with, has a relative importance value of 0.64. And since this is a relative importance, that tells us that evergreen forests are twice as important for black-throated green warblers. So even though these might be the top 5 habitat types that this species is found in, the most important is evergreen forest, and it's twice as important as the next most important habitat. So this tells us a lot more about our birds on our refuges, what habitats they rely on, and where we can effectively focus our management. Putting all this together, understanding the trends at the regional scale here in the Mid-Atlantic and New England region, the trends at the national level, along with how much similarity in habitat type there is between one period, which is the breeding period, and the non-breeding period, allows us to be much better stewards of the bird populations. And this is just an example of all of this information collected for the American robin, which has been declining at a rate of 0.6% per year over 50 years. So even one of these very common generalist species like the robin has been declining pretty steadily. Okay. So there we go. And this information, both in terms of the habitats that these birds are affiliated with and the long-term regional trend across the Mid-Atlantic and New England region, is all contained within that report for every single species that we detected in these surveys. So the last 40 pages of this report, if you thumb through it and you're trying to make heads and tails of what all this stuff means, actually goes through and explains all of that information that I just went through in terms of which habitats are important. And the most important habitat oftentimes is quite a bit more important than the second most important habitat type for individual species. We took all of this information and we created a list of responsibility birds. We did not say, okay, these are the most beleaguered birds. These are the ones that are experiencing the most decline, because for some of these species, they've been in very steep decline for a very long period of time, and their populations are so low or they're so rare across our landscape that there's really not much that the Audubon Society can actually do to supplement local and regional populations. There are also species that are declining because we know that factors found along the migratory route or in the non-breeding grounds of Central and South America are really what's driving the decline. So no matter how much management you do up here where they breed, if they're all dying when they go south for the winter, that's not going to help supplement the population. So we identified species that we know we can do something about. So there are clear actionable steps that Audubon and our volunteers can go out and do to help these birds. They are relatively easy to monitor, meaning since we are so reliant on volunteer data, if a volunteer who doesn't know their birds extremely well wants to go out and find these birds, they're easy to find, they're easy to locate based on sight and sound. And so we can have relatively inexperienced volunteers collect meaningful data on these species. And then the third selection criteria was, does this species act as an umbrella species? The goal here is to save all of our birds, not just these 9 responsibility birds. And so it's important that we're choosing birds that are affiliated with a habitat type or a guild in which conserving one species is indirectly going to benefit all of the other species that share that same habitat type. So these are the 3 selection criteria we use to identify our species that are responsibility birds. We identified 9 total species that we plan to continue to do intensive studies on. I'll just go through a few of those right now briefly, and then mention what we plan to do with them towards the end. So we have the aerial insectivore group. Again, these are birds that eat on the wing, they sleep on the wing, and in some instances, like the chimney swift, they can't even perch. Their feet are placed so far on the back of their body that they hang upside down like a bat. So this is a bird that flies around all day long, eating insects on the wing. And because those insect populations have been in decline for such a long time, many of the species found in this guild are also declining. We have 2 aerial insectivores as responsibility birds. The first is the chimney swift, which is declining at a rate of 1.5% per year over 50 years. Below that, you can see just how much red is on this map of Eastern North America. The species, which is affiliated with urban environments, human modified landscapes, because as the name suggests, they actually nest and roost in chimneys. They are declining as less and less people have chimneys available for them to use. As more and more people cap their chimneys, it prevents these birds from using them as habitat. And so there are a number of actionable steps that we can take to promote this population. The responsibility bird on the right is the barn swallow. This is a species that's declining at just under 1% per year. It is ubiquitous. The barn swallow is found throughout large amounts of our landscape, and yet if you look at Eastern North America, you can see that it is declining very, very steadily. We don't have very many barn swallows nesting on Audubon parcels, but we do know that when they are found on Audubon parcels, they are almost always affiliated with forested swamps. So these are birds that are using our forested wetland habitats as foraging habitat because there are lots of insects emerging from our forested swamps, and these birds are profiting from that banquet. And so this is an example of a responsibility bird where we can learn as much as we possibly can about the health of the habitat that they rely on and how they utilize that habitat in the hopes that we can do something to attract more and allow them to forage more successfully when they visit our refuges. Looking at the early successional habitats, these are the scrub-shrub habitats. And we find a number of species also in decline here as well. We have 2 more responsibility birds affiliated with early successional habitats. The prairie warbler on the left, declining at a rate of 2.7% per year. This is a species that is found along forest edges in young forest habitats and in open scrubby fields. And this is a species that we have on a large number of our refuges. And on the right, you have the common yellowthroat. As the name suggests, this is one of the most common warblers across all of the United States of America. It can be found breeding from coast to coast. However, as you can see from the trend graph and the graphic below it, it has been declining at a rate of 1.5% per year. So what's going on with the common yellowthroat? Well, we don't know because it's still considered a species of least concern, and there therefore are not very many studies looking at how the bird is doing, what the bird requires. And so here's an example of us trying to be proactive. We want to keep our common yellowthroat common. So it is incumbent on us now to start looking at our common yellowthroat population, figure out what they're relying on from a habitat perspective, and hope that we can provide that to them to better enable their success here in Rhode Island and hopefully the region as well. As a whole. Remember, what we do here in Rhode Island, we want to catch like wildfire and spread throughout New England and have multiple agencies within New England sharing the type of monitoring work we're doing so that we can help large-scale populations, not just those found in our small state. The forest foraging guild, again, this is, remember, the most dominant habitat type we conserve. There are large numbers of species declining in the forest guild. 2 that are our responsibility birds include the black and white warbler on the left. which is a unique warbler because unlike many warblers, it nests on the ground and it spends a large amount of its time on the lower half of trees foraging. So for our volunteers, it's much easier for them to sit back with their binoculars and collect data on what they're foraging, what habitat they're using, and whether or not they are nesting, because these are birds that are found down low and they are warblers, and that is a rarity. On the right is the wood thrush. This is a species that's been declining regionally for quite some time. There are international conservation groups dedicated to the conservation of this species. And so this is a bird that actually breeds in Rhode Island in relatively large densities. And on one of our refuges in particular, the George Parker Woodland, we have the highest breeding density of wood thrush of anywhere in the state of Rhode Island. So clearly, if this is a bird that's in decline and it's found more frequently on our refuges than anywhere else, then it's also incumbent on us to understand as much about this species as we possibly can. Again, we have declines in our generalist birds. So mourning doves, blue jays, American robins, common grackles, these are all species in decline, which surprises many. Urban birds, the European starlings that have been introduced to our country, are declining very rapidly. So too are the rock pigeons, which oftentimes people don't like rock pigeons, but they are a primary food source for peregrine falcons. They do serve an ecological role, and they have been declining steadily at almost 3% per year over a 50-year period. So this is all to say that we have a game plan. We've created a game plan. Step one is complete of our state of our birds. We know where birds are found. We know what habitats they rely on, and we know which birds we want to collect more information on, which are our responsibility birds. The second step in our three-tiered approach is to monitor those species, which are responsibility birds. And then the third and final tier of our approach is to apply what we've learned through that monitoring. So once we really understand what these 9 species require, we will be most effective when we start managing them and our habitats for them. What's to come? The State of Our Birds report, which was released back in late January, was just part 1. There is part 2, and that second part is actually going to cover migration. We collected data on a year-round basis as part of our baseline data collection. During the spring, we collected information from ARUs, or acoustic recording units, that we had distributed across our refuges in different habitat types. These were recording continuously from the 1st of April all the way until the 1st of August. And we can glean recordings from these units to understand which species moved through during periods of migration. We also had a lot of our volunteers conduct fall walking transect surveys across our refuges, in which they visited the same refuge multiple times to collect as much information as they possibly could on our fall migrating birds. This is just basically, you guys are the first to see these. These are actually graphics that will be in the next State of the Birds report, which is coming out in May. I'm feverishly working on it right now to finalize it. But this is the type of information that we'll be able to see. So this is a graph that just shows the chronology of neotropical migrants, those species that breed here in Rhode Island or further north in the boreal forests of Canada, and migrates all the way down into the Central and South American tropics during the non-breeding season. And this shows their timing of passage through the state of Rhode Island during fall. So, for example, if I'm looking at just one of these species, let's say blackpoll warbler right here, BLPW is blackpoll warbler. We have our first blackpoll warblers detected in the state of Rhode Island during our surveys about mid-September. And then we had them throughout surveys all the way until the end of October. So we were finding blackpoll warblers as early as mid-September, and they trailed off after the end of October. And the average, the bulk of them, when we had the most detections for this particular species, came around the 2nd week of October. So that's when the bulk of all blackpoll warblers move through our refuges. And so we have this information for every single one of those species that pass through in fall. And again, every single one of those species that pass through during periods of spring migration, when northern water thrush first show up, when the last of the water thrush are detected before they leave the region, broad-winged hawks when they show back up after migration, black and white warblers when they show up. All of this information is going to be contained in that second report, which is forthcoming. We also know from all of the data analysis that I've been doing over the last month and a half from the migratory periods, how much of our state these birds are occupying during periods of breeding, fall migration, and spring migration. So for example, the black-throated green warbler, which is BTNW down here, I know it's a confusing code, but it is the AOU 4-letter code for that species, is found in 70% of Rhode Island during spring migration. You detect a lot of black-throated green warblers. 82% of the state in fall migration. So more of our state hosts black-throated green warblers during fall than in the spring migration period. And 20% of our state is suitable for breeding birds that stop and breed in the state as a whole. So this says that for this species, the bulk of their use of our state comes during fall migration, followed closely by spring migration, and a relatively small number of them actually stop and breed in the state. So this allows us to visualize how they use our state throughout the year and where we should be focusing our efforts. So that's the second part of our State of Our Birds report, which is coming out in just a little over a month and a half. We have the monitoring of our responsibility birds, which will begin this breeding season. We will have atlas-style data collection. So if you participated in the recently completed State Bird Atlas, and you are familiar with how we went about collecting data, looking at how birds behave, whether they're building nests, whether they're tending fledges, whether they're just males that are singing on territories, that's the kind of information that we're going to be having our volunteers collect. They're going to be collecting it specific to those 9 species. So instead of looking at just every single species, we're really going to be focusing on those 9. I should also say that concurrent with all of this monitoring, I will be doing these point counts all over again. And the idea is that we will continue to do these point counts year in and year out so we can see how things change. We can see how the total numbers of birds change. We can see how habitat associations might change from one year to the next. So look in mid to late March for advertisements for the training sessions for the monitoring of our responsibility birds. If you would like to volunteer for that effort, come out, help collect data during the period of breeding, which is primarily when we'll be collecting this information, then you can sign up for one of our trainings and you can come learn about how you can contribute data to this project. When you're out looking at responsibility birds, what we're really going to be focusing in on is their phenology. A lot of what's driving declines is this phenological mismatch, which is the important biological periods of the life of an organism. And for a bird, that means when they show up from migration during the spring, when they start building their nests, on average, when they lay eggs, when those eggs hatch out, and when those birds undergo molt and then subsequently leave on fall migration. All of the timing of when birds do these things that is specific to Rhode Island is very important to understand. If we don't know when birds show up, if we don't know when on average they start looking for nesting sites, then we don't have much power to help with regards to providing those resources when they are here looking for it. So this is how we're going to monitor our responsibility birds, and everyone is going to be able to input their data if they want to come out and help with that data collection. So stay tuned on those training dates. Like I said, again, if you have not yet looked at this report, it is lengthy, it is comprehensive. And after tonight's lecture, hopefully, if you look through it again, if you've already looked through it once, you'll understand more about what you're looking at. But I'm always here. I'm always available to have folks contact me through email or contact me about the volunteer research opportunities, ask questions, and I will facilitate in any way that I can. So thank you very much for your attention. Now, I said I was going to give you 20 minutes for Q&A, and now I'm instead going to only give you 10 because, as always, I tend to go over. But I will stop my share. Now we're back. And I can see, I can see those of you who have your cameras on. And I will simply ask if anyone has questions or wants clarification about anything that we just covered about the report itself, the monitoring of those responsibility birds, or anything else. You can feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question. You can physically raise your hand if I can see you. And if you don't have your camera turned on, you can raise your hand through the chat function, and I will address your questions as I see them. If you want to put your questions into the chat, I'll also answer them as they come in. Yes, Rose, you had your hand up. You can unmute and ask away.
Please, thank you. Sorry, I'm brand new to this, and I feel very fortunate that I ran into someone on the Emily Rucker Trail, and they told me about you, and I was like, what? I'm very excited to get involved, and I don't know anything about it. So what would you recommend? Where would be the first place for me to go to begin to volunteer on the trails? And yeah, what should I show up at one of, who would you recommend I go see, and how do I get started?
It would be me. So I'm the one who's organizing all of our data collection. And when it comes time to train volunteers, recruit them, and get them out collecting data, I am going to host training sessions. Usually those are all via Zoom so that they are more accommodating of people's schedules. I'll have probably 5 or so training sessions throughout the end of the winter. And at any point you can sign up for any of those, sit through that, where I will go over detailed information on how you can contribute data and how you should go about doing it. Because again, the most important thing is that this is standardized data collection, that everyone who wants to go out and help does it the exact same way, so that we can compare your results to someone else's, to mine. So making sure that everyone who wants to contribute sits through a training, understands how to collect that information. That's all going to be covered in the training. So I will hold the trainings early enough that I will go through things in a training that if you feel like you need to bone up on these 9 responsibility birds, you'll have time to do it. And I will tell you, just as a precursor to those trainings, that one of the things you can do if you are not familiar with these 9 species very well is to familiarize yourself with them. Go to the Birds of the World, which is a wonderful website managed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The National Audubon Society also has an online repository for all species found in North America, where you can look at photos of the birds, listen to their vocalizations, read about their habits. And learning about a bird is perhaps the easiest way to familiarize yourself with it, so that when you get out in the field, you know how to find it. Because quite frankly, birds and habitats are inextricably linked. So if you know what habitats to look for, you're going to find the species you're targeting. So that would be a good way to get started, and then look ahead to see these trainings when they are announced. Sign up for one, sit through one, and you'll learn everything else you need.
Could I have 2 more questions if it's okay, unless somebody else has a question?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm all ears.
Okay. So like the first time going out, do you organize little groups so like I could go and kind of shadow somebody? Is that something that'll be shared when you set the training?
Yes. So I always like to pair folks who feel as though they need some guidance with people who have been doing this for quite some time, who are expert birders. And so I always work to pair individuals who would like to have that ability to go out, to learn things, and also to contribute data. So when I go through the training, I will specify how to get in touch with me, and I will put people together who might want to be paired. Some people just like to go out and bird on their own, and they've been doing it a long time and they know their birds. Other people want to contribute data. They're very, very passionate, but they don't feel comfortable going out and collecting all the data on their own, and they would like to shadow someone or go with somebody who might know the bird vocalizations more. And so I help facilitate putting small groups together, and I'm always happy to have people come out with me as well.
Lastly, how do I get on your list?
So if you go onto asri.org, which is Audubon Society Rhode Island.org, you can go into the Avian Research Initiative links, and you can contact me directly through that. And you can ask any questions you want, make any requests, and I will do my best to try to get those requests answered. And so I can, have you come out with me if you would like to do that.
And when you advertise, is this advertised through Audubon? And is that how we can see when they're happening and we sign up with you, just like today?
Yes. Yep. Exactly. So Audubon will be putting out emails. Everyone who's attended these talks will be getting the email into their inbox with a call for volunteers. And at that time, we'll have all of the dates, and you can click up and register for any of those dates that you are available for. Okay. Thank you, Rose. I see one question in the chat, which is, is there thinking that lawn care / mosquito or tick spraying is affecting the decline of some of these species such as robins? That's an absolutely wonderful question. And the answer is probably. Yeah, there is a global decline in insect populations. Insects themselves are probably even more, to be honest, of a linchpin with regards to our own health and the health of the environment around us than birds are, because insects fill every single habitat, and they provide so many ecosystem services that you can write, and many books have been written about all the things that birds do, from pollinating to pest control to all of these things, and they're all important, and the insects themselves are declining. Clearly, a huge number of bird species rely on insects as their primary dietary consumption item. So they are feeding themselves insects, they are feeding insects to their young, and they're doing it in large quantities because this high protein, high lipid and amino fatty acid diet is very important for the growth and development of chicks and for the maintenance of the adult body. So birds are incredibly reliant on insects to meet their own physiological demands and the demands of their chicks. And if there are fewer insects available for them to eat, they simply will not be as successful. Fewer of them will make migration successfully because they won't have the energetic stores to do it. And fewer of those chicks will be raised to fledge because there, simply put, is not enough insects prey to go around. The insecticides themselves that are being used, oftentimes these pesticides are quite negative in terms of their impact on wildlife populations like birds. Sprayed on insecticides can get into our waterways, can get into soils, can impact insect populations where the insects don't die, but transmit that insecticide or that pesticide onto the birds themselves, who then bioaccumulate it and suffer from a myriad number of complications. Some of that can be neurasthenias, which is basically activated stress hormones in the bird, which leads to weight loss because they're activating their energetic stores to bolster their immune system as opposed to just live their life, fly around, look for food. So a bird that is full of pesticides is going to be a sickly bird because of its physiology doing what it can to protect the individual bird itself. So yes, great question. And the answer is, without question, applications of large-scale pesticides and insecticides to lead to the decline of these insect populations will have a measurable impact on the local avian community. Let's see, there is one more question. Where do I go to learn the shorthand initials for birds like BTNW? You can Google that. This is the American Ornithological Union that creates these 4-letter codes. It's quite difficult because every one of the 10,000 bird species on Earth has its own unique 4-letter code, and that's why some of them don't seem very intuitive. BTNW doesn't seem like the most intuitive 4-letter code for a black-throated green warbler. However, there is a black-throated gray warbler that is BTGW. So you can Google search AOU 4-letter alpha codes. You can find a number of documented sources of it. You can download these forms that have everyone, and these codes change annually. So as ornithologists, we have to keep up with those changes to make sure that we're using them correctly and not for some different species than the one that we're actually referencing. But when I submit my reports, when you have these reports in hand, like the State of the Birds report, every one of these 4-letter codes is defined. So you can look at the code and you can look it up and find out exactly what species I'm referencing. The problem with creating big graphics like charts, graphs and tables and writing out the full name of birds is that oftentimes it takes up a tremendous amount of space in that graphic. And I would rather you see the graphic itself, like the trend line, see what's going on and understand that. And then the name itself can be something that you look up and translate. So thank you all for coming out, for supporting Audubon. We really appreciate it. We could not do the work that we do without your support. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And please go forth and be stewards to our birds and the world that they need for everything that they do. All right. Have a good night, folks.